She thought she was going to die. Ayanna Redfeather had never been so certain of her fate. The hunters closed in, their shadows growing longer as the evening sun dipped below the horizon. She had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the weight of her fear pressing down on her chest. Her back was against the rock wall, the deep ravine behind her offering no escape. The men were getting closer, and Ayanna's heart raced. She knew what was coming. She had heard stories of people like her, captured, punished, or worse. She thought of her family, her tribe. The thought of them finding out what happened to her. It broke her. But then, just when she thought it was all over, she heard it. Hooves. The sound of a horse's gallop echoing through the canyon. The hunters froze. Their eyes darted around, confusion spreading through them. Who could it be? Was someone coming to finish the job? Ayanna barely had time to look up before a figure appeared on the ridge above her, silhouetted by the fading light. He was tall, strong, and, despite the danger surrounding them, his presence seemed almost reassuring. Ayanna couldn't believe her eyes. A cowboy? In these parts? The man didn't hesitate. He spurred his horse forward, his movements confident and precise. The hunters looked at each other, unsure of what to do. But the cowboy didn't wait for them to make up their minds. With a quick draw of his rifle, he fired a shot into the air, the sound echoing through the canyon like a thunderclap. The hunters backed off. They knew better than to engage with someone like him. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. Ayanna's heart slowed, the adrenaline draining from her limbs. She didn't know whether to thank this stranger or run from him. Was he here to help, or was this some twisted game? The cowboy rode down the slope, his horse steady under him, until he was just a few feet away. He dismounted, his boots thudding against the dirt. "You all right?" he asked, his voice steady, but there was a hint of concern in his eyes. Ayanna wanted to speak, to thank him, but the words stuck in her throat. She was still too shaken. The cowboy offered a hand, his palm open, waiting. Ayanna hesitated for a moment before reaching out. She took his hand, and he pulled her to her feet. The touch was firm, but gentle. He helped her onto his horse, then swung up behind her. The sound of the hunters retreating echoed in the distance, but Ayanna didn't turn to look. She couldn't. She was still in shock. As the cowboy guided the horse up the steep path, Ayanna couldn't help but wonder who this man was. Why did he help her? What did he want? She knew nothing about him. But as they rode together into the fading light, Ayanna felt something shift inside her. Could this be the start of something new? Something that would change everything? The ride was long, the air cold, and the landscape unfamiliar. Ayanna clung to Jesse's back, her body sore from the earlier confrontation. But there was something about the steady rhythm of the horse that made her feel safer than she had in hours. The sound of the horse's hooves against the dirt was the only noise between them, the wind whispering through the trees as they moved deeper into the wilderness. Jesse didn't speak much, but his presence was enough to calm her racing thoughts. She kept her eyes on the path ahead, not daring to look back. The hunters could still be following. "We're far enough for now," Jesse said after a while, breaking the silence. His voice was low but steady, the kind of voice a man had when he'd seen enough to know how to stay calm in a crisis. Ayanna didn't respond. Her mind was too full, too chaotic. She had so many questions. Who was this man? Why had he saved her? She had heard the stories about cowboys, how they were dangerous, how they could never be trusted. Yet here she was, riding with one, not knowing what to expect next. As they continued, Jesse guided the horse through a narrow pass, the trees thick around them. It was a secluded spot, one that felt miles away from the civilization Ayanna had known. The further they went, the more isolated she felt. It was as if they were disappearing into the wild, where no one could find them. She shivered, but it wasn't just the cold. She was beginning to feel the weight of being alone with someone she knew nothing about. She glanced over her shoulder, but all she could see was the faint outline of the ridge they had crossed. The hunters were gone, for now, but the uncertainty still lingered in her chest. "You can rest," Jesse said, noticing her fatigue. "We'll make camp for the night." She nodded, still unable to find her voice. They stopped by a small creek, its waters rushing over the rocks. Jesse dismounted first and then helped Ayanna down. She winced slightly as her feet hit the ground, the strain of the day's events catching up with her. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Jesse looked at her, his expression unreadable. "It's the least I could do," he replied, unstrapping a small bundle from the side of his horse. He quickly set up a small campfire, the crackling sound of the firewood adding a comforting warmth to the otherwise cold air. Ayana watched him move with ease, his actions deliberate and calm. For a moment, she just observed him, her mind trying to make sense of everything. Jesse wasn't like the men she had heard about in stories. He didn't seem dangerous, at least not in the way she had been taught to fear. He was a cowboy, yes, but there was something more to him. He wasn't a hero. But then again, heroes didn't always look the way they were supposed to. As night fell, Jesse set out some simple food by the fire, a piece of bread, some dried meat, and water from the creek. Ayana ate in silence, her mind still running in circles. She was thankful for the food, for the warmth of the fire, but there was something unsettling about this situation. She wasn't used to relying on anyone, especially not a stranger. When they finished eating, Jesse spoke again, his voice softer this time. "I'll stay up for a while. You should sleep." Ayana didn't argue. The exhaustion from the day's events had caught up with her, and her eyes were heavy. As she laid down by the fire, the warmth of the flames fighting off the chill of the night, she found herself staring up at the stars, the quiet of the wilderness settling around her. She had no idea where this path would lead. She didn't even know who Jesse really was. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she could breathe. And maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Ayana stirred. She had slept fitfully through the night, the sounds of the forest and the crackling of the campfire filling her dreams. The fire had burned low, casting shadows that danced across the ground. Jesse was still sitting near it, his face illuminated by the fading embers. He had kept watch as promised, his eyes alert but calm. Ayana slowly sat up, wincing slightly from the soreness in her muscles. The air was cool, but the warmth from the fire was still comforting. Jesse looked over at her, a soft smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Morning," he said, his voice deep but gentle. Ayana nodded, rubbing her eyes. She hadn't realized how much she needed rest until now. "Thank you for last night," she said, her voice quiet. Jesse didn't respond right away, instead reaching for his gear to pack up the camp. "No need to thank me. Just doing what anyone would do," he replied, though there was a quiet humility in his tone. Ayana didn't believe that. She had heard of cowboys before, how they were ruthless, how they cared only for themselves. But Jesse was different. He wasn't like the stories. She wasn't sure what to make of him yet. Her instincts told her to be wary, but a part of her couldn't help but trust him. The silence stretched between them as they packed the camp. Ayana's mind raced, still trying to piece together the events of the past 24 hours. She had been on the run, desperate and alone, when Jesse had appeared. He had saved her life. And now, here they were, riding together through the wilderness, with no clear destination in mind. What was she supposed to do now? The weight of her responsibilities to her people pressed down on her chest. She needed to find them, to warn them. But how? She didn't even know where to start. Jesse seemed to sense her unease. "You want to talk about it?" he asked, looking over at her as they rode side by side. Ayana hesitated. She had never been one to open up to strangers. But something about Jesse's presence made her feel like she could. "I don't know where to go," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "My people, my tribe, they're in danger. I need to warn them, but I can't do it alone." Jesse nodded thoughtfully. "You're not alone," he said simply. The words were enough to make Ayana's heart tighten. She didn't know why, but she believed him. He wasn't just talking about the physical danger. He was offering something more, something she hadn't realized she needed until now. Ayana looked at him, studying his face for any sign of doubt or hesitation, but there was none. His steady gaze met hers with an understanding that almost seemed to go beyond words. "Thank you," she said again, this time more firmly. Jesse smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him. "No problem. We'll figure it out together." The day stretched on as they rode through the wilderness, the path winding through dense forests and over rocky terrain. They spoke little, each lost in their thoughts. Ayana couldn't shake the feeling that their journey had only just begun. She had no idea where they were heading, but for the first time in a long while, she wasn't afraid. She was with someone who would help her, someone who would stand by her side. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give her hope. She glanced at Jesse again, her thoughts racing. Could this really be the beginning of something new? Something that could change everything? The journey continued through the rugged wilderness, the landscape shifting with each mile. Ayanna and Jesse rode in silence, the weight of unspoken thoughts hanging between them. Ayanna's mind was consumed with the pressing danger to her people. Every step they took seemed like another moment slipping away. The path was narrow, winding through dense trees that whispered in the wind. The air felt thick with anticipation, and Ayanna couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though she saw no one. Jesse seemed to sense it too. He glanced over at her, his expression unreadable, but there was a quiet intensity in his gaze. "Something on your mind?" he asked, his voice steady but not unkind. Ayanna hesitated. She had been holding so much inside for so long, afraid of trusting anyone. But with Jesse, something was different. She had no words for it. I don't know what to do next," she admitted. "I don't know where my people are." "The hunters," her voice faltered. "They could be anywhere." Jesse nodded slowly. "We'll find them. You're not alone in this." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Ayanna's chest tighten. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had said those words to her. She had always carried the burden alone, the leader of her people, expected to know what to do at all times. But now, in this strange partnership with a cowboy, she was beginning to realize how much she had been missing. Jesse turned his horse slightly, his gaze ahead as he scanned the terrain. "The thing about the land," he said after a long pause, "is that it tells you where to go, if you know how to listen." Ayanna looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "It's the small things," he explained. "The way the wind moves, the way the animals act. If you pay attention, you'll see things." Ayanna considered this for a moment. She had always trusted her instincts, her connection to the earth. But with everything happening so fast, she hadn't had time to listen to the land. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself to feel the quiet hum of nature around her. The soft rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird. Slowly, she opened her eyes and nodded. She understood now. The land wasn't just something to traverse. It was something to understand, something to read. As they rode on, the path before them opened up to reveal a wide clearing, the forest giving way to tall grass that swayed gently in the breeze. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting a golden light over the landscape. Ayanna felt the tension in her shoulders ease as they entered the open space. "We should rest here," Jesse said, pulling his horse to a stop. "It's too dangerous to travel further in the dark." Ayanna agreed, though part of her felt the weight of time pressing on her. They didn't have much left, but exhaustion had begun to settle in, and there was something comforting about the stillness of the clearing. As Jesse set up camp, Ayanna watched the sun slowly set, the sky turning a deep shade of orange. She felt a strange sense of peace wash over her, though her mind was still filled with worry. There was too much at stake, too many lives depending on her. Jesse worked in silence, his movements fluid and purposeful. When he was finished, he sat down by the fire, the crackling flames casting shadows across his face. Ayanna joined him, her legs stiff from the ride. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice carrying more than just gratitude. It was an admission. She had never been one to rely on others, but here she was, trusting him more than she had trusted anyone in a long time. "You don't have to thank me," Jesse replied, his voice soft but firm. "We're in this together now, and I'll help you see it through." The fire crackled, the warmth of the flames a small comfort against the cool night air. Ayanna sat back, her thoughts momentarily quiet. For the first time since the chaos had started, she felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward. It wasn't certain. It wasn't guaranteed. But with Jesse by her side, it was a path worth following. As the night settled around them, the stillness of the clearing was broken only by the crackling of the fire. Ayanna sat on the ground, staring into the flames, her mind racing with the weight of everything she had yet to face. Jesse had already settled in for the night, his back resting against a tree, eyes closed but still alert. Ayanna glanced over at him, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. She could hear his steady breathing, calm and rhythmic. It was a strange comfort in the midst of the chaos that surrounded them. The firelight danced across his face, casting long shadows that made him seem like a man lost in his own thoughts. For a moment, she wondered about him. Who was he really? What had brought him to this remote corner of the world, helping a stranger like her? She wasn't sure what to make of him yet, but she knew one thing. He wasn't like the others. He didn't carry the arrogance of the settlers she had encountered, nor the distrust that most cowboys had for her people. Jesse was different. He had proven that with every small gesture, every quiet word. He hadn't asked for anything in return. He simply helped. Ayanna shook her head, trying to push aside the thoughts swirling in her mind. There was no time for distractions. She needed to stay focused, to find her people and warn them before it was too late. But as the fire flickered, she realized something else. She wasn't as alone as she had thought. Maybe, just maybe, Jesse was the ally she needed. "You all right?" Jesse's voice broke the silence, his eyes opening to meet hers. Ayanna nodded, offering a small smile. "Just thinking," she replied softly. Jesse didn't press her further. Instead, he sat up straighter and tossed a few more logs onto the fire, the flames dancing higher. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice steady and confident. "You'll find your people. And when you do, I'll be there to help." His words were simple, but they carried a weight of truth that Ayanna hadn't realized she needed to hear. She believed him. "Thank you," she whispered, the words more heartfelt than she had intended. Jesse gave her a small smile before returning his gaze to the fire. They sat in silence for a while, the crackling of the fire the only sound between them. Ayanna's thoughts drifted back to her tribe, to the danger they faced, but for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. She wasn't alone. The night stretched on, the stars overhead shining brightly in the vast, dark sky. Ayanna felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, but for the first time, it didn't feel quite as heavy. She had someone by her side, someone she could trust, and together, they would find a way to stop whatever was coming. As the fire began to die down, Jesse stood and stretched, his movements slow but deliberate. "We'll need to keep moving at first light," he said, his voice low but firm. "But we can rest here for now." Ayanna nodded, her eyes following the embers as they drifted into the night sky. She had no idea where their journey would take them, but she knew one thing for certain. She was ready to face whatever came next. With Jesse by her side, she wasn't afraid. The fire flickered once more before fading into the dark, and the night embraced them both in its quiet, uncertain stillness. Ayanna closed her eyes, letting the sound of the wind lull her to sleep, the promise of the morning a distant hope on the horizon. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. Ayanna woke to the soft rustling of leaves, the quiet murmur of the creek nearby. She had barely slept, her mind still racing with the uncertainty of their situation. Jesse had already packed up most of their things, the sound of him moving around the camp breaking the silence. He glanced over at her, his expression calm as always. "Ready to go?" he asked, his voice steady. Ayanna nodded, though she wasn't sure if she was truly ready. The weight of her responsibility still hung heavily on her shoulders. As they mounted their horses, Ayanna couldn't help but glance around, her eyes scanning the trees, the distant horizon. Every shadow seemed to hide something, every noise felt too close. She was still on edge, the tension of the previous days refusing to release its grip on her. Jesse noticed her unease and slowed his horse to ride beside hers. "You all right?" he asked, his voice softer now. Ayanna met his gaze, feeling the weight of her thoughts press down on her. "I don't know where to go next. My people, they could be anywhere. The hunters could be right behind us." Jesse's brow furrowed slightly, but he said nothing at first. They rode in silence for a moment before he spoke again. "We'll figure it out," he said simply. "One step at a time. You don't have to do this alone." Ayanna looked at him, the sincerity in his words cutting through the doubt that had clouded her mind. She had spent so long thinking that she had to carry the burden alone, but now, with Jesse by her side, something shifted. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she didn't have to face it by herself. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. Jesse nodded, offering her a small smile. "No need to thank me. We're in this together." They rode for hours, the land stretching out before them, endless and unforgiving. The path was rough, winding through dense forests and rocky terrain, but Jesse led the way with ease, his experience in the wilderness guiding them. Ayanna followed closely behind, the rhythm of the ride slowly easing her nerves. She tried to focus on the present, on the journey they were making together, rather than the dangers that still loomed on the horizon. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Ayana felt a growing sense of resolve. They couldn't stop now. She had to find her people, warn them of the danger, and protect her tribe. Jesse's steady presence beside her was a constant reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. She stole a glance at him, his face set in a determined expression as he rode ahead. There was so much about him she didn't understand, but one thing was clear: he was more than just a cowboy. He had become a partner in this fight, someone she could rely on when everything else felt uncertain. As they reached the edge of a dense forest, Jesse slowed his horse and looked back at her. "We need to be careful from here on out," he said, his voice low. "This is territory that's been known to have raiders. We don't want to run into any trouble." Ayana nodded, her senses alert. She had been on edge for so long that the thought of encountering more danger seemed almost inevitable. But she wasn't afraid, not with Jesse by her side. They moved cautiously, the forest growing thicker around them, the trees casting deep shadows on the path. Ayana's mind raced with thoughts of her people, her tribe. What would they do if they knew she was coming? Would they welcome her, or would they see her as a threat? She didn't know the answers, but she had to find out. As the day wore on, the landscape began to change, the trees thinning out and giving way to rolling hills. The air was cooler now, the wind picking up as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. Ayana could feel the weight of the day on her shoulders, but she pushed forward, determined to keep going. Jesse, too, seemed unaffected by the growing fatigue. His movements were smooth, his focus unwavering. She admired his resilience, his ability to keep going no matter what. As they reached the top of a hill, Jesse paused and looked out over the valley below. Ayana joined him, her eyes scanning the land. Far off in the distance, she could just make out the outline of a village. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it her people? The thought filled her with both hope and fear. They had made it this far, but what would await them when they arrived? From the top of the hill, the valley stretched wide and quiet, too quiet. Ayana narrowed her eyes, her breath slowing as she studied every detail below. Smoke should have been rising from cooking fires. Horses should have been grazing near the edges. Movement, voices, life. Instead, there was stillness, the kind that did not belong to a living place. "Something is wrong," she said softly, more to herself than to Jesse. He did not answer right away. His gaze moved slowly across the valley, measuring, reading, the same way he had read the land before. Then he nodded once. "Yeah," he said. "It is too quiet." The wind brushed across the tall grass around them, bending it in long waves. Ayana felt it then, not fear, not yet, but a tightening in her chest, like the land itself was holding its breath. She urged her horse forward a few steps, then stopped again. "If they are there," she said, "I need to go." Jesse turned his head slightly toward her. "And if they are not?" Ayana did not answer, because that was the question she had been avoiding since the moment she saw the valley. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the reins. "I have to know." Jesse studied her for a long second, then gave a small nod. "Then we do it careful." He guided his horse down the slope, not straight toward the village, but along the ridge line, keeping to higher ground where they could see without being seen. Ayana followed, her eyes never leaving the valley. The closer they got, the heavier the silence felt. No birds, no distant voices, just wind and dust. Half a mile out, Jesse raised a hand. They stopped. He leaned forward slightly in the saddle, focusing on something ahead. "Tracks," he said quietly. Ayana leaned closer, trying to see. The ground below showed faint marks, not fresh, but not old either. Too many to count. Horses, wagons, movement in and out. Her pulse quickened. "My people do not move like that," she said. Jesse nodded. "I figured." They rode a little closer, slower now. Every step felt louder than it should. Ayana's breathing became shallow, controlled. Her instincts were screaming now, not to run, but to be ready. They reached a line of rocks overlooking the village. Jesse dismounted first, then helped her down without a word. They moved forward on foot, careful, quiet. When Ayana finally saw the center of the village clearly, she stopped. Her body went still. Nothing was destroyed. Nothing was burning. But it was empty. Completely empty. The lodges stood untouched, as if everyone had simply walked away. Her heart dropped. "No," she whispered. Jesse stayed beside her, saying nothing, because there was nothing to say yet. Ayana stepped forward slowly, her feet moving before her thoughts could catch up. They would not leave, she said, her voice barely holding together. Not like this. Jesse crouched near the edge of the slope, studying the ground again. Then he reached out and picked something up. Ayana turned. In his hand was a small object. A piece of cloth. Worn. Familiar. Her breath caught. She stepped closer, her hand trembling as she took it from him. It was part of a sash. One she recognized. Someone from her tribe. Someone close. She closed her eyes for a second, steadying herself. Then she opened them again, different now. Sharper. They did not leave, she said, her voice low, certain. Jesse looked at her. Then what happened? Ayana clenched the cloth in her hand, her gaze fixed on the silent village below. They were taken, she said quietly. The wind moved through the empty lodges, carrying dust across the ground like whispers. And for the first time since the journey began, Ayana was not just afraid. She was certain of one thing. This was not the end of the road. It was the beginning of something far bigger than either of them had expected. The silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt occupied, as if something had passed through and taken the sound with it. Ayana stepped into the village slowly, each footfall careful, almost reverent, like she was walking through a memory that refused to speak back. The lodges stood exactly as they had been, hides stretched tight, tools left where hands had once placed them. Nothing broken, nothing scattered, just absence. That was what made it worse. Jesse followed a few steps behind, his eyes moving constantly, scanning, measuring. He did not touch anything. He understood enough to know this place was not his to disturb. Ayana moved toward the center fire pit. The ashes were cold. She knelt beside it, pressing her fingers gently into the gray dust. No warmth. Not for a long time. Her chest tightened. They were not rushed, she said quietly. They were gathered. Jesse stopped behind her. You mean they went willingly? Ayana shook her head slowly. No. My people would not leave everything behind unless they had no choice. She stood, her eyes sharper now, no longer searching for hope, but for truth. She walked toward one of the lodges and paused at the entrance. The flap moved slightly with the wind. Inside, everything was still. A blanket folded. A bowl half filled with dried corn. A child's carving resting near the wall. Life interrupted. She reached down and picked up the carving. Her fingers tightened around it. They were told to go, she said. Not forced. Not chased. Led. Jesse frowned slightly. Led where? Ayana stepped back outside, her gaze sweeping the horizon again. Then she turned slowly, looking past the village, toward the narrow pass on the far side of the valley. The ground there was marked. Faint, but clear if you knew how to see. Lines in the dirt. Direction. Purpose. There, she said. Jesse followed her gaze, then nodded once. That many people moving together, they would leave a trail. Ayana began walking toward it without hesitation. Jesse moved beside her. We should be careful, he said. Whoever did this, they planned it. Ayana did not slow. Then we cannot waste time. Her voice had changed. The fear was still there, but it had hardened into something steadier. Resolve. When they reached the edge of the pass, Jesse crouched down, studying the ground again. He brushed his hand lightly over the dirt, tracing the marks left behind. Wagons, he said. At least 2. Maybe more. Ayana's jaw tightened. My people do not use wagons. Jesse glanced up at her. Which means someone brought them. The wind picked up again, carrying dust through the narrow path ahead. It looked like just another stretch of land. But now it meant something else. Ayana stepped forward, stopping just before entering the pass. She looked back once at the empty village. The place that had been full of voices, of firelight, of life. Now silent. Waiting. She closed her eyes for a brief moment. Not in grief. Not yet. In promise. When she opened them again, there was no hesitation left. We follow, she said. Jesse stood beside her, adjusting the strap on his saddle. He did not ask questions. He did not argue. He simply nodded. We follow. They mounted their horses again, turning toward the narrow path where the trail disappeared into shadow. The sun was lower now, casting long lines across the valley behind them. Ahead, the land stretched unknown, quiet, and waiting. And somewhere beyond that silence were answers neither of them were ready for. The pass narrowed as they rode in, the walls of stone rising on both sides like silent witnesses. The light dimmed with every yard, the sun falling behind the ridge until only a thin line of gold remained above them. Ayana rode ahead now, her posture straight, her eyes fixed forward. She was no longer searching. She was following. Jesse stayed just behind her, watching the ground, the walls, the sky above. Every detail mattered now. The trail was clearer here. Wagon wheels pressed deep into the dirt, hooves layered over hooves, a path carved by intention, not chance. After nearly a mile, the pass opened slightly, enough for the wind to move again. It carried something with it. Not sound, not voices, but the faint trace of smoke. Jesse noticed it first. He lifted his head, drawing in a slow breath. "You smell that?" he asked quietly. Ayana did not answer with words. She nodded once, already urging her horse forward. The pace quickened, not reckless, but urgent. The land began to slope downward, the path widening just enough to reveal what lay beyond. They reached the edge at the same time. Both of them stopped. Below, in a shallow basin surrounded by rock, stood a camp. Not a village. Not like hers. This was different. Structured. Ordered. Wagons in a circle. Horses tied in rows. And near the center, people. Ayana's people. Her breath caught, but she did not move. She watched. Carefully. No panic. No chaos. The people below were moving. Slowly. Controlled. Watched. Jesse narrowed his eyes, studying the scene. "They are not being hurt," he said quietly. "They are being held." Ayana's fingers tightened around the reins. "Why?" she whispered. Jesse did not answer right away. Because the answer was not in the ground. It was in the details. And then he saw it. Near the largest wagon, standing apart from the others, was a man, well dressed for this land. Not a drifter. Not a wanderer. Someone with purpose. Someone who planned things. Jesse's jaw tightened slightly. "I have seen men like that before," he said. Ayana glanced at him. "What kind of men?" Jesse kept his eyes on the camp. "The kind that do not take land with guns," he said quietly. "They take it with paper and people." Ayana looked back at her tribe, at the way they stood together, not broken, not scattered, waiting. She understood then. This was not an attack. It was a claim. Someone had decided her people belonged somewhere else, and was moving them like pieces on a board. Her breath steadied. Her fears shifted. Not gone. Just changed. "We cannot rush in," Jesse said. "Not yet." Ayana nodded slowly. For the first time since they entered the pass, she stepped back. Not away, just enough to think. The wind moved again, carrying dust across the edge of the basin. Jesse turned slightly, studying her face. "You got a plan?" he asked. Ayana looked at the camp one more time. Then she looked at the small piece of cloth still wrapped in her hand. The one she had carried since the village. She closed her fingers around it. Tight. "Not a plan," she said quietly. "A truth." Jesse raised an eyebrow slightly. Ayana stepped forward just enough to be seen if someone looked up. "Not hidden. Not afraid. They think we are alone," she said. "They think we have no voice." Jesse watched her, understanding beginning to form. And Ayana's eyes did not leave the camp. "They are wrong." The wind carried her words down into the basin. Not loud, not shouted, but steady. And for the first time, one of the men below looked up. Then another. Jesse exhaled slowly, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth. Not because this would be easy, but because now it was clear. Out here, justice did not begin with a gun. It began with someone willing to stand and not step back. They thought he was marking her as his, but the truth stood quieter than the dust in the air. The sun hung high over the town, heat pressing down on wood and bone, turning every breath dry as ash. And right there in the center of the street, Silas Reed lifted a worn silver necklace, its turquoise stone catching the light like a piece of sky, and placed it gently around Ayana's neck, his hands steady, his eyes unreadable, while the town held its breath. Because to them it looked like ownership, like a claim no different than cattle or land. And a murmur rolled through the watching crowd, low and sharp, but Ayana did not step back, did not flinch. She only felt the weight of the pendant settle against her skin, cool despite the heat, familiar in a way that made her chest tighten, as if it carried a memory older than both of them. And for a moment her fingers rose, hovering near the stone without touching it, as though she understood something the others did not, something Silas himself had not yet seen. And when she finally spoke, her voice came soft, almost carried away by the wind. "It's too much." The words drifted between them, and a few men shifted where they stood, expecting refusal, expecting defiance, expecting her to tear the necklace away and run. But she didn't. She lifted her gaze instead, meeting Silas's eyes with a calm that felt heavier than anger. And there was no fear there, none at all, only a quiet measure, like she was weighing something far beyond the moment, far beyond the town, far beyond him. And then she finished, barely louder than before. "But I accept." The silence that followed pressed harder than the heat, stretching long enough that even the horses tied along the rail seemed to still, their leather creaking softly in the wind. And somewhere in the distance, a loose shutter knocked against wood in a slow, steady rhythm. But no one spoke, because no one understood what had just happened. Not really. Not the men who thought they had witnessed a bargain sealed. Not the women watching from shaded porches. Not even Silas, who lowered his hand. Slowly, as if unsure whether he had just taken something or given something away, and Ayanna stood there with the necklace resting against her collarbone, her posture unchanged, her presence untouched, like the act itself had not reduced her, had not claimed her, but had instead drawn a line no one else could see. And beyond the town, past the last fence post where the dust met the open land, shapes lingered along the ridge, still as stone, watching, waiting, their figures barely visible against the pale horizon. And though no one in the street turned to look, though no voice named what stood out there in the distance, the air carried a weight that did not belong to the town, a quiet that did not belong to silence. And Ayanna felt it, the same way she felt the necklace against her skin, the same way she felt the moment shift beneath her feet, because this was not the end of something. It was the beginning of a question no one here was ready to answer, and the answer would not come from words, nor from force, but from a choice that had already begun to take shape the second that silver touched her skin. Freedom is easy to offer when you think no one will take it. The words were not spoken aloud, but they lingered in the space between them, carried in the way Ayanna held Silas's gaze, steady and unbroken, as if she had heard something deeper than what he said. And the street seemed to narrow around that moment, the buildings leaning in with their long shadows, the heat settling heavier against the dust, and still she did not move, not forward, not back, not away from him. And the necklace rested against her skin like a quiet promise neither of them fully understood, and Silas felt the weight of his own words settle into him, because he had meant them, or at least he thought he had. Yet now that they were spoken, they did not feel like an ending. They felt like the beginning of something he had not prepared for. And Ayanna finally shifted, just enough to let the light catch the turquoise stone again, her fingers rising slowly, brushing the edge of it, not to remove it, not to reject it, but to acknowledge it, like one might acknowledge a memory. Returning after a long silence, and when she spoke, her voice carried further this time, not loud, but clear. "You say I am free," she said, her words measured, each one placed carefully. "But you do not yet know what that means." And a murmur moved through the town again, softer now, uncertain, because this was not defiance, it was something else, something that did not fit into the simple lines they understood, and Silas felt a flicker of something shift inside him. Not anger, not frustration, but recognition. The kind that comes when a man realizes he has been looking at a thing the wrong way for longer than he cares to admit. And he did not answer right away, because for the first time in a long while, he was listening, not to her words alone, but to the space behind them, the meaning that did not need to be spoken. And Ayanna turned slightly then, not away from him, but toward the open land beyond the town, toward the ridge where the figures still stood, their presence now more certain, more real, as the light shifted and outlined them against the horizon. And though they remained distant, their stillness carried intent, not threat, not yet, but purpose, and she knew they would not wait forever, not for confusion, not for hesitation, only for truth. And she looked back to Silas, her eyes steady, and there was something softer there now, not weakness, but understanding, as if she had already seen the path he was only beginning to find. And she stepped closer, just one step, enough that the space between them changed, enough that the town noticed, and the sound of boots shifting on wood followed, quiet but present. And Silas did not step back. though something in him told him this moment mattered more than any he had faced before, because it was not about control, not about decision. It was about something far more difficult to hold. And Diana spoke again, her voice lower now, meant for him, though the silence carried it to all who listened. "If I walk away," she said, "you will believe you did the right thing." And her fingers rested lightly against the pendant. "And if I stay, they will believe you took something that was never yours." Her eyes flicked once toward the ridge, then back to him. "But neither of those will be true." And the words settled into him like a slow weight, not sharp, not sudden, but undeniable, and Silas understood then, not completely, but enough to feel the edge of it, enough to know this was no longer about what he wanted, or what the town expected, or even what the watchers beyond the ridge might demand. It was about what was chosen freely, without force, without claim, and that kind of choice could not be made for someone, not even with good intention. And the wind shifted again, carrying a faint sound from the distance, not loud, not clear, but enough to remind him that time was moving, that waiting would not last forever. And Ayanna stood there, calm, unhurried, as if the answer had already taken root inside her, and all that remained was whether he would understand it in time. A choice means nothing if it is shaped by fear. The words settled low in Silas's chest, not spoken, but understood, and for the first time since he stepped into that street, he did not look at Ayanna as something to protect or defend or decide for. He looked at her as someone standing on her own ground, even here, even surrounded by eyes that did not understand her, and the difference was quiet, almost invisible, but it changed everything. And the sun had begun to dip just enough to stretch the shadows longer across the boards, turning the space between them into something deeper, something that held weight. And Ayanna felt that shift the same way she felt the wind change before a storm, subtle, certain, and she lowered her hand from the necklace, letting it rest again against her skin, no longer something new, no longer something foreign, but something that had found its place. And behind them, the town stirred again, voices rising just enough to break the stillness, questions forming, assumptions returning, because people needed meaning to feel steady, needed simple answers to hold on to. But this moment refused to give them that, and Silas took a slow breath, the kind a man takes when he knows the next thing he says will not be taken back, and he glanced once toward the ridge, toward the figures who had not moved, not retreated, not advanced, only watched, and something about their patience told him, more than any threat could have, told him that what happened here would carry beyond this street, beyond this day, into something that would not be undone easily. And he turned back to Ayanna, meeting her eyes again, and this time there was no claim in his posture, no edge of ownership in his stance, only a question that had finally found its shape. "Then what does it mean?" he asked, his voice steady, quieter than before, but stronger in a way that did not rely on force. And Ayanna studied him, not his words, but the space behind them, the place where intention lives, and she saw it there. The shift, small but real, and it softened something in her expression, not enough to be seen by those watching, but enough to change the way she stood, the way she breathed, and she stepped past him then, just slightly, enough that she was no longer facing him directly, but standing beside him. Both of them turned toward the open land beyond the town, and the movement was simple, almost nothing, yet it broke the line that had separated them before, and the town noticed, even if they did not understand. And the wind carried a faint sound again from the distance, closer now, not loud, not urgent, but present. And Ayanna spoke, her voice calm, certain. "It means you do not speak for me," she said, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "And I do not run because I am told to." And the words settled into the air like dust, light but impossible to ignore, and Silas felt them land, felt the truth in them, not as something given, but something earned. And he nodded once, not to agree, not to claim understanding he did not fully have, but to accept that he was learning, and that was enough for now. And the figures on the ridge shifted again, clearer this time, their forms distinct against the fading light, and the distance between them and the town felt shorter than before, not in miles, but in meaning. And Ayanna watched them without fear, without hesitation, because she knew they were not coming for what had already been decided. They were coming to see what would be chosen next. And beside her, Silas stood still, not stepping forward, not stepping back, because for the first time, he understood that the moment did not belong to him to move, and the town, caught between what they expected and what they were witnessing, fell quiet again, waiting, even if they did not know for what, and the answer, when it came, would not belong to them either. The land always knows before the people do. The thought moved through the air like the first breath of evening, and the light had softened now, turning the edges of the town gold and long, stretching every shadow until it touched something else, and out beyond the last fence, the figures on the ridge began to move, not fast, not in a rush, but with the steady certainty of men who had already decided to come, and the distance between them and the town closed inch by inch, hoof by hoof, though no sound reached yet, only the sense of it, like a storm scene far off before it is heard. And Ayanna watched without blinking, her posture unchanged, her hands resting loosely at her sides, while the turquoise stone at her throat caught the fading sun and held it there, quiet and bright. And beside her, Silas felt the shift deepen, felt the moment stretch into something that would not be undone by a single word or a simple gesture, and behind them, the town could no longer pretend not to see. Heads turned, voices dropped, and a few men stepped back from the street as if distance alone might keep them clear of what was coming. But no one left, no one walked away, because something in the air held them there, something larger than curiosity, larger than fear, and Silas did not move either, though every instinct he had built over years told him to prepare, to act, to control what could be controlled. But this was not that kind of moment, and he knew it now, knew it the same way he knew the weight of a storm before it broke. And Ayanna took a slow breath, the kind that settles into the bones, and when she spoke, her voice carried only to him, though it seemed to reach further. "They will not ask," she said, her eyes still on the horizon. "They will only watch." And Silas nodded once, because he understood that much, understood that whatever came next would not be taken, it would be seen, measured, remembered, and that made it heavier than anything he could face with a steady hand or a quick draw. And the riders came closer now, their shapes clearer, their movement deliberate, no rush, no threat, just presence. And the town grew quieter still, the kind of quiet that settles when people realize they are no longer the center of what is happening. And Silas felt something loosen in his chest, not relief, but a release of the need to hold the moment in place. And he turned his head, slightly toward Ayanna, not to lead, not to follow, but to stand with. And she felt it, the absence of pressure, the absence of claim, and it changed the space between them more than any word could have. And she stepped forward then, not away from him, not toward the town, but toward the open space between, where the dust lay undisturbed and the light fell clean, and the necklace moved softly against her collarbone with each step. No longer a question, no longer a symbol to be explained, but something she carried by choice. And the riders slowed as they neared, their horses easing into stillness at the edge of the street, their presence filling the space without a sound. And no one spoke, not the town, not the men on horseback, not even the wind. And in that silence, Ayanna stopped, standing alone between two worlds that watched her, one behind, one before, and Silas remained where he was, not stepping forward to stand beside her, not stepping back to distance himself, because he understood now that this line was hers to cross or not, and nothing he did would change what it meant. And the air held, waiting, and Ayanna lifted her chin just slightly, her eyes steady as she faced what had come for her, not as something to be taken, not as something to be returned, but as someone who would answer only for herself. And the moment balanced there, quiet, fragile, and absolute, as if the entire land had paused to see what she would choose next. Some truths do not arrive with words. They arrive with who is willing to stand still. The riders did not dismount, not yet, their horses quiet beneath them, breath slow, leather creaking softly in the cooling air, and the man at the front, older than the others, sat straight in the saddle with a stillness that carried more weight than any command, his eyes fixed on Ayanna, not with anger, not with urgency, but with something deeper, something that measured without needing to ask. And Ayanna met that gaze without lowering her own, her chin steady, the turquoise at her throat catching the last edge of sunlight. And for a long moment, nothing happened, no one spoke, no one moved. And yet everything shifted, because this was not a meeting of force. It was a meeting of understanding, and the town behind her felt it without knowing why. Their voices gone now, their presence reduced to watching, uncertain and small against something they could not name, and Silas stood where he was, his hands loose at his sides, his weight balanced, not ready to act, not ready to retreat, simply present, and he watched the man on the horse, watched the way his eyes never left Iana, and he understood then that whatever passed between them did not need language, did not need explanation. It was already known, and Iana took one step forward, not toward them, not away from them, but into the space where choice lives, and the dust shifted under her boots, a small sound that carried further than it should have, and the man on the horse tilted his head just slightly, a movement so small most would miss it, but Iana did not, and neither did Silas. And that was enough to tell them both that the moment had changed, that something unseen had been acknowledged, and Iana spoke then, her voice calm, clear, not raised, but certain. "I came here by my own steps," she said, not to explain, not to defend, but to state what already was, and the man on the horse listened, his expression unchanged, but his stillness deepened, as if the words had settled exactly where they needed to, and Iana continued, her eyes never leaving his, "And I will leave, or stay, the same way," and the words fell into the space between them, simple, complete, needing nothing more, and for a moment longer, the man said nothing, did nothing, and then, slowly, he exhaled, a breath that seemed to carry the weight of the distance between them, and his hand lifted, not toward a weapon, not toward command, but open, palm resting lightly against his chest, a gesture of acknowledgement, of something older than the town behind her, older than the lines drawn across this land, and the riders behind him did not move, did not speak, they simply held their place, as if the decision had already been made the moment she spoke, and Silas felt it then, the release of something he had not known he was holding, a tension that had been built from years of believing every moment required his action, his decision, his control, and now, standing there, he understood that this one did not, that this one belonged to her, entirely, and he did not step forward, did not try to stand beside her, because he knew that would change the meaning of what was happening, and Iana felt that too, felt the absence of interference, the quiet respect in his stillness, and it settled into her like a steady ground beneath her feet, and the man on the horse lowered his hand, his gaze still on her, and though no words followed, the message was clear enough for those who understood how to see it, that she was not being taken, not being returned, but being witnessed in her choice, and the light faded another degree, the sky shifting toward the deep tones of evening, and the moment held, not fragile now, but firm, as if it had found its place, and Iana stood there, between two worlds that no longer pulled at her, because she was not standing between them at all, she was standing within her own. Respect is the only thing that cannot be taken, only recognized. The evening settled deeper across the town, shadows stretching long and quiet, and the air felt different now, no longer tight with uncertainty, but heavy with something steadier, something earned, and the riders remained where they were, their presence no longer pressing forward, no longer demanding, but simply there, as if the moment itself had reached its answer without needing another word, and Iana stood unmoving, her shoulders relaxed, her breath even, the turquoise pendant resting against her chest like it had always belonged there, not as a mark, not as a claim, but as something chosen, and the man on the horse watched her for a long second more, his gaze steady, then slowly he turned his head, just slightly, toward the others behind him, a movement so small it might have been missed by those who did not understand its meaning, but the riders did, and one by one, without a word, they eased their horses back, not retreating in haste, not leaving in defeat, but stepping away with the same quiet certainty they had arrived with, and the distance between them and the town began to grow again, not as a break, but as a release, and Iana watched them go, her expression unchanged, because this was not loss, this was not separation, this was acknowledgement, and when the last of them turned with the fading light, disappearing beyond the ridge, the land seemed to breathe again, a slow, steady exhale that moved through dust and wood and skin alike, and behind her, the town stirred, not loudly, not boldly, but in low voices, uncertain, trying to fit what they had seen into something they could understand, but failing because there was no simple shape for it, no clear story to tell, and Silas stood where he had been, his eyes following the ridge until the last figure was gone, and only then did he shift, just slightly, the weight of the moment settling into him in a way that would not leave quickly, and he looked at Ayanna, not as someone he had taken in, not as someone he had to protect, but as someone who had stood her ground in a way he had not fully known how to do until now. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left that needed saying, not yet, and the quiet between them was no longer heavy, no longer uncertain. It was clear, like open land after a storm has passed, and Ayanna finally turned, not toward the town, not toward the ridge, but toward him, her gaze steady, and there was something different there now, not distance, not challenge, but a quiet recognition, as if she had seen what she needed to see. And she reached up, her fingers brushing the edge of the pendant once more, and this time there was no hesitation, no question, only acceptance, not of him, not of the town, but of her own choice. And Silas understood that without asking, understood it in the way a man understands something that cannot be explained, only felt, and he gave a small nod, not as permission, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, and the town watched, still trying to decide what had happened, still searching for a story that made sense. But the truth had already passed them by, quiet as the wind, steady as the land itself, and it did not belong to them to hold. The hardest thing a man can do is nothing when everything in him wants to act. The last light of day stretched thin across the emptying street, turning the dust into a soft glow that clung to boots and boards, and the town began to breathe again, not with relief, but with confusion, voices rising in low murmurs that never quite reached full volume, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever had just settled over the place. And Silas remained still for a moment longer, his eyes no longer on the ridge, but on the ground between where Ayanna had stood and where he stood. Now, that narrow strip of dirt that had held more weight than any boundary he had ever known. And slowly, he stepped forward, not to close distance, not to claim space, but simply to move as a man who no longer needed to hold himself back. And Ayanna watched him without turning fully, her posture relaxed, her attention no longer divided between two worlds, because the choice had already been made, and it did not require repetition. And when Silas stopped beside her, not ahead, not behind, the space between them felt different again, no longer a question, no longer a test, but something quieter, something steady, and he spoke then, his voice low, meant only for her, though the stillness carried it further. "I did not know what that necklace meant," he said, not as an excuse, not as a defense, but as a truth offered without weight. And Ayanna tilted her head slightly, her gaze softening just enough to show she heard him fully, and she answered without hesitation, "It was not meant for you to know." Her words calm, unburdened, and that answer did not sting, did not close anything. Instead it opened something he had not expected, a space where not knowing was allowed, where learning did not come with shame. And Silas let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it, only recognition, and he nodded once, accepting that truth the way a man accepts the weather, something larger than himself, something that does not need to be controlled to be understood. And the town watched them, still trying to gather what remained of the moment, but their understanding stayed shallow, tied to what they had seen, not what had passed beneath it. And Ayanna turned then, finally facing him fully, her eyes clear, steady, and she studied him for a long second, not judging, not testing, simply seeing, and whatever she saw there seemed to settle something inside her, because she reached up once more, her fingers resting briefly on the turquoise stone, and then she let her hand fall, leaving it where it belonged, not as a symbol of him, not as a tie to the town, but as something that had found its place through her own choice. And she stepped forward again, this time not into the space between, but toward the far end of the street, away from the center, away from where all eyes had gathered. And Silas did not stop her, did not ask where she was going, because he understood now that the direction mattered less than the decision. And after a moment, he followed, not close, not distant, simply present. And the two of them moved through the town in a quiet line, side by side but not bound, their steps steady, unhurried, and behind them, the voices grew again, louder now, trying to shape what had happened into something that could be told, something that could be owned. But the truth did not stay there. It moved with them, out of the center, out of the story the town wanted to keep, and into something else entirely, something that would not be explained in words, only remembered in the way a man stands still when it matters, and the way a woman chooses without asking permission. Out here, nothing belongs to you unless it chooses to stay. The town fell behind them one quiet step at a time, the sound of boots on wood fading into dirt, then into the open stretch where the land widened and the air felt different, cleaner somehow, as if it carried fewer expectations, and the last of the voices drifted away with the evening wind, leaving only the steady rhythm of two sets of footsteps moving side by side without urgency, without need to speak, and the sky had turned deep gold now, sliding slowly toward dusk, the kind of light that does not last but leaves something behind when it goes. And Ayanna walked with her gaze forward, not searching, not hesitating, the pendant resting still against her chest, no longer catching the light, but holding it in a quieter way, and Silas kept pace beside her, not watching her every move, not measuring the distance between them, because he understood now that distance was not something you closed by stepping closer. It was something you honored by standing where you were meant to stand, and for a while, neither of them spoke, the silence not empty, but full, like a pause that does not need filling, and the land stretched ahead, open and patient, as if it had seen this before, as if it knew how these moments unfold long before the people inside them ever do. And finally, Ayanna slowed, not stopping completely, just enough to shift the rhythm, and Silas matched it without thinking, the two of them coming to stand near a low rise where the town could still be seen behind them, small now, distant, its edges softened by the falling light, and she turned then, not fully, just enough to look back once, her eyes resting on the place where everything had happened, where voices had risen and fallen, where choices had been misunderstood, and she held that gaze for a moment longer than necessary, not out of regret, not out of doubt, but out of acknowledgement, because even a place that does not understand you can still be part of your path. And then she looked forward again, letting that piece of the past settle behind her without needing to carry it further. And Silas watched her do it, watched the quiet certainty in the way she moved, and he realized something that had not been clear before, something that did not arrive as a thought, but as a feeling that settled deep and steady, that nothing he had done had brought her here, and nothing he could do would keep her if she chose otherwise. And that truth did not diminish him. It did not leave him empty. It left him clearer, like a man who has finally stopped trying to hold water in his hands and instead lets it run as it will. And he spoke then, not because he needed an answer, but because the moment asked for honesty. "If you walk away," he said quietly, his voice even, "I will not follow." And the words carried no weight of expectation, no hidden request. They simply